The sea holds secrets that can erase empires in a single voyage. This is the story of the 25 Imperial Armadas that disappeared without a trace in uncharted waters. We will chart these ghostly fleets, from colossal Chinese treasure ships to Roman galleys swallowed by the Atlantic, uncovering how each catastrophic loss reshaped the course of history. You will discover the common threads behind these vanishings and what modern searches tell us about our enduring drive to explore. How did a fleet carrying an emperor's fortune simply cease to exist? And what forgotten panic swept through a capital when its greatest navy failed to return? By the end, you will see the ocean not as empty space, but as a vast and active player in human destiny. What do you believe is the greatest force a civilization can face? Think of the most advanced machine you can build, and then imagine sending it into the unknown with no guarantee of return. That was the monumental risk behind every Imperial Armada. These were not simple collections of ships, they were the ultimate expressions of a state's ambition, engineered to project power across oceans. A typical armada was a complex, living organism. At its heart were the great warships, floating fortresses armed with cannons and manned by hundreds of sailors and marines. Surrounding them were the vital support vessels, the floating warehouses carrying food for months, fresh water in giant casks, spare sails, and tools for repair. Then came the troop transports, packed with soldiers meant to secure a new territory, and diplomats, scholars, and even craftsmen. This entire mobile city could number in the hundreds of vessels, requiring a command structure as intricate as any royal court, all operating on the open sea, far from any home port. Their missions were equally grand: to conquer a rival kingdom, to establish a colony that would funnel wealth back to the capital, or to secure a monopoly on priceless goods like spices or silk. They carried the emperor's seal, his authority, and in many cases a significant portion of his treasury. The disappearance of such a force was therefore not just a maritime accident, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The loss of thousands of trained personnel, the squandering of immense resources, and the blow to imperial prestige could stall an empire's expansion for a generation. This scale is precisely what transforms these events from mere historical footnotes into profound mysteries. How does something so large, so deliberately constructed, and so central to a civilization's story simply cease to be, leaving not a single plank to tell the tale? The answer often lies not in the fleets themselves, but in the uncharted waters they dared to enter. Uncharted waters were not merely empty space on a map, they were a psychological frontier. To an admiral holding a vellum chart, those blank areas represented pure potential, a canvas upon which an empire could paint its greatest fortunes. The same emptiness, however, whispered of ancient fears, of edges where the world dropped away into an abyss, or where leviathans waited to crush ships whole. These spaces were filled not with data, but with legend. Sailors' tales spoke of magnetic islands that pulled nails from hulls, of tranquil seas that could suddenly boil into fury, and of mists that never lifted, concealing jagged coasts. For the navigator, this meant every decision was a calculated guess. They used the astrolabe to measure the sun's angle and the cross-staff to chart the stars, but these tools were useless under weeks of cloud cover. They followed known currents, but a sudden shift could push a fleet hundreds of miles off course toward reefs that existed on no chart. The psychological weight was immense, sailing for months with no sight of land, trusting in the accuracy of a map that might be half rumor. An armada, for all its military power, was profoundly vulnerable in this environment. A single, localized storm that would be a minor setback in home waters could become a fleet-ending catastrophe if it drove those massive ships onto an unseen shore. This is the core paradox of these voyages, the very ambition that propelled empires forward, the drive to fill those blank spaces, also created the perfect conditions for total, silent disaster. The ocean did not need to be actively malicious, it simply had to remain unknown. Centuries before the age of Viking longships, an emperor looked west from the very edge of the known world. Our first vanished fleet belongs to Rome under the reign of Claudius, a ruler fascinated by expanding the empire's frontiers. While his legions famously conquered Britain, whispers in ancient texts suggest a parallel ambition was launched upon the Atlantic. Historians note that Claudius, a scholar emperor, may have authorized a formidable naval expedition with a staggering goal: to sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar, and explore the ocean rumored to hold new lands for Rome. This was not a trade mission, it was a deliberate act of imperial exploration. A fleet of triremes and support vessels carrying the Eagle standard into absolute mystery. Think of the moment those galleys passed the last familiar headland. For the Roman sailors, the Mediterranean was a predictable realm, a sea they could navigate by known coastlines and established winds. The Atlantic, however, was a different entity entirely, a vast, open wilderness of powerful currents and weather patterns they did not understand. The fleet, a symbol of Rome's supreme engineering, would have been shockingly vulnerable once it left the continental shelf behind. We have no manifest, no captain's log, only ambiguous references in later chronicles that speak of an expedition that never came back. The silence that followed was absolute. No wreckage washed ashore, no survivors ever returned to tell of storms or strange coasts. The entire enterprise and everyone aboard was simply erased. The theories surrounding its fate are a mirror for every vanished fleet to come. One possibility is a single, catastrophic storm, an Atlantic tempest that could scatter and swallow even the sturdiest triremes in a matter of hours. Another suggests the fleet may have reached a distant shore, only to face challenges for which their military might was unprepared. Perhaps conflict with local peoples or the slow, silent hardship of an unknown illness in an isolated land. The most haunting idea is that they simply became lost, their navigational methods useless in the open ocean, sailing in a hopeless circle until supplies ran out. This early disappearance is a foundational lesson. It reminds us that the ocean's capacity to keep secrets is ancient, and that the price for overreaching into the blue unknown has been paid in full since the dawn of empire. The loss of Claudius's fleet, if it ever truly sailed, echoes forward, a ghostly precedent for the far larger armadas that would follow it into oblivion. While Rome's ambitions faded into Atlantic legend, another empire on the opposite side of the world was launching fleets of unimaginable scale. The Sui dynasty, though brief, was an era of colossal projects, from the Grand Canal to a military machine of terrifying efficiency. Emperor Yong, a ruler driven by a vision of absolute dominion, did not just build armies, he built navies. Historical accounts describe shipyards that stretched for miles along the Yellow River, where thousands of laborers worked to construct towering multi-decked warships, some said to be large enough to carry entire regiments of soldiers. These were not vessels for simple river patrols, they were instruments of conquest and imperial spectacle, designed to overwhelm any coastal kingdom and showcase the Sui's supreme might. The emperor's gaze turned south toward the rich and mysterious lands bordering the South China Sea. It is here, in the fragmented records that survived the dynasty's violent collapse, that we find whispers of a phantom armada. Later chroniclers from the succeeding Tang dynasty make oblique references to a great southern expedition, a fleet sent to extend the emperor's reach over the maritime trade routes. And then the record simply stops. There is no triumphant report of its return, no list of tribute brought back, no tales of battles won. The fleet and its fate vanishes from history. This disappearance is a different kind of mystery. It is not necessarily a mystery of weather or navigation, but a mystery of memory. When the Sui dynasty fell, its bureaucratic records were systematically destroyed. An entire imperial administration's worth of documents, logs, and reports was erased. A fleet that might have met a tragic end in a typhoon, or perhaps faced a defiant coastal kingdom, sank twice, first in the water and then again in the annals of time. The silence is so complete that historians today debate whether the fleet was ever dispatched at all, or if it was merely a planned project that never left the docks. This forces us to confront a haunting possibility that some of our 25 vanished armadas may be ghosts in the deepest sense, lost not to the sea, but to the fragility of human record-keeping. The Sui's Phantom Fleet reminds us that history is not just written by the victors, it is also edited by them, and in that process, entire chapters of ambition and loss can be washed away, leaving only a rumor of sails on a distant horizon. The Mediterranean was supposed to be a Roman lake, a familiar domain patrolled by the heirs of empire. Yet even in these home waters, the sea kept its secrets. Centuries after the Western Empire's fall, the Byzantine Empire stood as the guardian of Roman maritime tradition, its survival dependent on the strength of its fleets. These were not vast exploratory armadas, but the essential police force of an empire surrounded by water. The empire was divided into military districts called themes, and among the most powerful was the maritime theme of the Sibiriots, whose naval squadrons were the shield of the Aegean and Adriatic coasts. Theirs was a routine of vigilance, patrolling trade lanes, deterring pirates, and showing the imperial flag in 1,000 harbors. It was precisely this routine that makes the next disappearance so unsettling. In the 8th or 9th century, amidst the dry administrative records and chronicles, there is a gap. A specific squadron, assigned to a standard patrol circuit, simply failed to return to its home port. The historical note is often as brief as it is final, a single line stating the fleet was lost, with the cause vaguely attributed to a storm, or perhaps to an encounter with enemy raiders. There were no grand battles recorded, no heroic last stands celebrated in song. One day the ships were present on the imperial roster, and the next they were a silent, unanswered question. For the local communities that depended on that squadron for protection, the absence would have been profound. Coastal villages, once secure, now felt exposed. Trade routes grew riskier without the imperial galleys to police them. The loss of several warships and their highly trained crews was a quiet but significant blow to the theme's defensive strength, a slow leak in the empire's hull that administrators would have struggled to plug. This case strips away the romance of distant exploration. It demonstrates that disappearance was not a fate reserved only for those who sailed off the edge of the map. Even within the most familiar waters, a fleet could be taken. A sudden, localized squall of unusual violence, a navigational error in fog that led a line of ships onto a hidden reef cluster, or a surprise attack by a fast-moving enemy fleet that left no survivors to report the engagement. Any of these could erase a squadron completely. The Mediterranean, for all its ancient history, remained a powerful and capricious force. The Byzantine patrol that never returned is a ghost story from the very heart of the civilized world, a reminder that the line between routine and catastrophe at sea was always vanishingly thin. Its story is not one of epic ambition, but of quiet, enduring mystery, absorbed into the bureaucratic silence of a struggling empire. Baghdad in the 9th century was the brilliant center of the world, a city of scholars, astronomers, and merchants whose network spanned continents. From its bustling ports on the Persian Gulf, the Abbasid Caliphate projected its curiosity and commerce far across the Indian Ocean. Arab navigators were masters of the monsoon winds, using this seasonal clockwork to sail to India, the Spice Islands, and the coast of East Africa with remarkable regularity. Their geographical knowledge, recorded in meticulous texts by writers like al-Masudi, was unparalleled for its time, filled with detailed accounts of ports, currents, and stars. Yet within this golden age of exploration lay a profound and accepted risk, for the quest for knowledge and wealth often demanded the ultimate price. The Chronicles speak of a particular fleet, outfitted not merely for trade but for discovery, commissioned by the caliph's court and departing from the great port of Basra. Its mission was to push beyond the established routes, to venture past the known limits of the Arabian Sea, and seek the fabled sources of gold rumored to be in lands like Sofala. This was a venture of high ambition, carrying the finest navigators, the most experienced merchants, and the hopes of the court for a direct path to unimaginable riches. What happened to this lavishly funded armada after it sailed beyond the horizon is a question the Indian Ocean has never answered. The powerful monsoons, so reliable for scheduled travel, could also transform into deadly cyclones with little warning, capable of overwhelming even the sturdiest Arab dhows. The currents along the Somali coast, known today as some of the most treacherous in the world, could have dragged the entire fleet onto razor-sharp coral reefs or into a maze of unstable sandbars. There is also the possibility they reached a distant shore, only to face challenges their meticulous maps could not prepare them for. The silence that followed was absolute. No wreckage bearing the mark of Baghdad's shipyards ever drifted back into familiar waters. No survivor returned to tell of new lands or tragic ends. The investment of wealth, expertise, and human life was simply absorbed by the ocean. This disappearance is not just a tale of a storm, it is a poignant underscore to the entire spirit of the Islamic Golden Age. The geographical mastery celebrated in their texts was often purchased through tragic loss. Every precise chart of a coastline, every detailed description of a monsoon pattern, likely came at the cost of earlier voyages that did not return. The vanished Abbasid fleet represents a specific, solemn entry in that ledger of discovery. Its story reminds us that the drive to map the world, to connect its distant corners, has always been fueled by a courage that accepts the very real possibility of becoming a footnote, a silent mystery that makes the knowledge for those who come after possible. The ocean gave the Abbasids a highway for their golden age, but it also asked for and kept its own solemn tribute. The wealth of empires was measured not just in gold, but in the scent of pepper and the weight of ivory. From the great ports of the Chola Empire on India's southern coast, a river of commerce flowed east across the Bay of Bengal. The Cholas were not merely traders, they were the masters of an entire maritime world, their influence stretching from the Coromandel coast to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Their ships, known as Kapal, were legendary for their size and seaworthiness, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean. We have stone inscriptions and copper plate grants that meticulously record the taxes levied on goods, the donations made by wealthy merchants to temples for safe passage, and the grandeur of the harbors. These records paint a picture of a system so vast, so routine, that its very success masked a terrifying vulnerability. It is within this context of colossal, normalized trade that we must place our fifth vanished fleet. Given the sheer volume of traffic sailing on strict monsoon schedules, it is not just possible but statistically likely that at least one major, state-sponsored trade convoy simply never made its scheduled return. Picture a fleet of 20 or 30 of these great vessels, a floating city of commerce commissioned by the emperor himself. Their holds would have been a treasure chest of the ancient world, packed with sacks of black pepper and cardamom, bolts of fine cotton and silk, intricate ivory carvings, and even live elephants, a royal gift for a distant king. Their destination was likely Srivijaya, the powerful thalassocracy based in Sumatra that controlled the vital Strait of Malacca, or perhaps a port even further east in the Java Sea. The voyage out, riding the predictable monsoon winds, might have been uneventful, but the return journey months later was a different story. The convoy, now laden with the return cargo of Chinese porcelain, Sumatran camphor, and Moluccan spices, represented a significant portion of the empire's annual commercial wealth. And then the waiting began. In the port of Nagapattinam, officials would have watched the horizon as the weeks for the expected return window came and went. First with concern, then with growing dread. A storm in the South China Sea, a navigational error that sent the fleet into the dangerous reefs of the Anambas Islands, or an encounter with pirates operating on a scale large enough to challenge an imperial convoy. Any of these could have sealed their fate. The silence that followed would have been deafening, yet curiously muted in the historical record. For the families of the merchants and sailors, it was an unthinkable personal tragedy. For the empire's accountants, however, it might have been logged as a catastrophic but singular business loss, an accepted risk of doing business across such distances. The loss of the convoy, its elephants, spices, and silks, would have caused financial ripples, perhaps a spike in commodity prices or the bankruptcy of a major trading guild. But in the grand, centuries-long narrative of the Chola Empire, such an event could be absorbed, noted, and then quietly buried beneath the records of more successful voyages that followed. This disappearance is perhaps the most haunting of all, because it represents a tragedy rendered ordinary by commerce. It speaks to the silent courage of every merchant and sailor who embarked on these journeys, facing an ocean that could, without ceremony or witness, convert immense fortune into absolute nothingness. Their story is not one of failed exploration, but of a routine journey that became a permanent mystery, a blank line in a ledger where a kingdom's wealth simply vanished into the blue. The empires of the ocean were not the only ones to pay the sea's price. Far inland, where the horizon is defined by jungle and river, another kind of maritime power faced its own silent mysteries. The Khmer Empire, whose stone temples at Angkor Wat reach for the heavens, was equally a master of the waters below. This was a hydraulic society, an empire built on the precise control of liquid, with vast reservoirs called barrays and a complex canal network that functioned as its lifeblood. Their navy was the guardian of this aquatic world, a force of long, sleek war canoes and heavy supply barges that patrolled the immense Tonle Sap Lake and the powerful Mekong River. These were the highways of Khmer power, used to project military force, collect tribute from vassals, and secure the flow of goods and people across the realm. During times of expansion or internal revolt, the court at Angkor could mobilize flotillas of startling size, hundreds of vessels carrying thousands of soldiers into the heart of the continent. It is here, on these familiar yet deceptive inland seas, that we place our sixth vanished fleet. Consider a major campaign ordered by the God King himself. A formidable naval force is dispatched upriver, pushing beyond the well-traveled channels of the lower Mekong into the contested or poorly mapped tributaries of the northern highlands. Their mission might be to subdue a rebellious chieftain or to secure a new source of timber or gems. To the commanders, this is a routine exercise of imperial might. But the river in these distant reaches is a different entity. The geography shifts from open water to a labyrinth of flooded forests, where towering trees rise directly from the water, their roots creating a submerged maze. The sky is a narrow strip of green filtered light, and the channels change daily with the subtle flow of the current. In such an environment, a single, catastrophic event could erase an entire fleet from history. A sudden flash flood cascading down from unseen hills after a monsoon downpour could raise the river level by meters in minutes, sweeping the heavy barges and canoes into a tangled, drowning chaos against the trees. Alternatively, the fleet could fall victim to a perfectly executed ambush by local forces who knew every twist of the waterway, using the forest cover to attack and then vanish without a trace, leaving no one to carry word back to anchor. Or perhaps it was a simple, tragic error in navigation, a wrong turn in the identical-looking channels that led the entire armada deeper into an impassable swamp, where supplies dwindled and the jungle slowly reclaimed both vessels and crew. The silence following such an event would be profound. At the capital, officials would wait for couriers that never came. Scouts sent to investigate would find only the endless, indifferent green of the forest and the steady flow of the river. With no physical evidence and no survivors, the expedition would simply be logged as lost, its fate absorbed into the local spirit folklore as new water ghosts joined the ancient ones. This disappearance fundamentally reshapes our understanding of uncharted waters. It proves that the blank spaces on a map were not exclusive to the open ocean. They existed deep within continents, along river systems that were highways one day and traps the next. The K.H. Mer's Lost Flotilla is a reminder that water, in all its forms, holds the same capacity for absolute secrecy, whether it stretches to the horizon or winds silently beneath a canopy of ancient trees. The empire's mastery over water was the source of its greatness, and in a cruel twist, it was also the medium of one of its most complete and silent defeats. Zeal is a powerful force, but it is no match for a sudden shift in the wind. As the Northern Crusades pushed Christendom's frontier into the pagan lands of the Baltic coast, the sea became a critical and brutally fickle ally. Every spring and summer, a unique maritime event would unfold known as the Lithe. This was not a permanent navy, but a seasonal fleet, urgently assembled from the bustling Hanseatic ports of Lübeck and Rostock. Its cargo was not silk or spice, but steel and faith, a floating convoy of crusading knights, their war horses, foot soldiers, and all the supplies needed to sustain a siege through the campaigning season. For the Teutonic Order, these reinforcements were the lifeblood of their holy war, an annual promise of strength from the heart of Europe to the remote, fortified outposts in Prussia and Livonia. The journey across the Baltic was a calculated risk, a race against the calendar. The knights, armored in their conviction, boarded cogs and transports, trusting the experienced Hanseatic captains to navigate the known yet notorious waters. But the Baltic Sea in autumn is a creature of immense and sudden fury. Warm continental air colliding with the frigid Scandinavian currents can spawn storms of legendary violence with little warning. A lithe fleet caught in such a tempest faced a singular horror. The ships, heavy with men and horses, were unwieldy and sat low in the water. A towering wave could smash a transport broadside, its cargo of animals and armor shifting instantly to seal its fate. In the chaos of wind and water, vessels would lose sight of each other, each fighting a solitary, desperate battle against the elements. It is entirely plausible that an entire contingent, hundreds of souls bound by a sacred oath, could have been overwhelmed in a matter of hours, every ship pulled beneath the gray waves without a single one reaching the safety of a distant headland. The aftermath of such a loss was a profound silence. At the Teutonic fortress under siege, commanders would wait in vain for the sails on the horizon. In European courts, the news would eventually arrive as a solemn report, a tragic loss mourned in masses and chronicled in a few sparse lines. Yet the sea offered no confirmation, no tangible evidence of the tragedy. This is the particular haunting of the Baltic, a sea known for preserving wooden shipwrecks in its cold, anoxic depths for centuries. While we have discovered magnificent vessels like the Vasa, the very conditions that preserve some ships can hide others forever. A fleet shattered by a storm would scatter across a vast area, its remnants buried under shifting sediments on a shallow seafloor, or broken into unrecognizable fragments against a rocky shore. The Crusaders' vanished lithe thus exists in a liminal space, a strong historical probability that has yet to yield its physical proof. It is a ghost fleet defined by absence, a reminder that even the most fervent human endeavors can be quietly, completely absorbed by the indifferent mechanics of weather and water. Their story shifts our gaze from the grand exploratory armadas to the essential supply lines of empire, where the routine voyage could become, without drama or witness, a permanent mystery. The legend of Mansa Musa's gold is a story told across continents, but it is the tale of the king who came before him that truly ventures into the realm of mystery. Arab historians, most notably Ibn Khaldun, recorded a startling account of Mansa Abubakari II, ruler of the Mali Empire in the early 14th century. According to these chronicles, Abubakari was a monarch consumed not by wealth but by curiosity. He reportedly made a decision that defies all conventional logic of power. He voluntarily abdicated his golden throne. His reason was to personally lead an expedition to solve a geographical riddle that haunted him: what lay beyond the western horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. The stories say he assembled an armada of immense ambition, 200 vessels stocked with enough food, water, and supplies to last for 2 years. This was not a small exploratory party. It was a floating city departing from the West African coast, carrying the hopes and the sovereign of one of the world's richest empires directly into the unknown. And then the same silence that swallowed Roman galleys and Chola convoys fell over this venture too. Neither the king nor any of his ships ever returned to Mali. The account exists in a historical twilight, vigorously debated by modern scholars. Some see it as a symbolic myth, a folk memory perhaps conflating with a real but smaller-scale voyage that met with misfortune. Others point to cultural and linguistic clues suggesting possible, fleeting contact with the Americas long before Columbus. The truth may never be fully settled. Yet, as a story, it holds immense power. It represents a profound what-if that echoes across the centuries. Here was a major West African imperial expedition, launched from the southern reach of the Atlantic, generations before Portuguese caravels began cautiously creeping down the African coast. It speaks to a drive for knowledge that was not exclusive to any one continent or culture, but a universal human impulse to look at a blank space on the map and dare to fill it. Whether fact or folklore, the tale of Mansa Abubakari's fleet captures the ultimate stakes of that impulse. It reminds us that the quest to discover what lies beyond the edge of the known world has always demanded a price, and sometimes that price is the complete and total surrender of the seeker to the secret itself. The ocean kept his answer, and in doing so, turned a king into a legend and an armada into one of history's most captivating ghosts. The poetry of empire often speaks in absolutes, claiming dominion over seas where no royal ship has ever sailed. For the Majapahit Empire, the greatest power the Indonesian archipelago has ever known, this was a daily reality of governance. Theirs was a thalassocracy, a realm of water, where control was asserted not by occupying every inch of land, but by commanding loyalty across a dizzying mosaic of islands. The magnificent poem Nagarakretagama sings of the king's glory stretching over 98 tributaries, a poetic list meant to convey an unimaginable reach. To maintain this web of power, the Majapahit court in East Java relied on a simple, brutal calculus, the credible threat of overwhelming force. When a vassal ruler on a distant island grew defiant, or when a lucrative spice trade route was threatened, the response was often swift and maritime. A punitive expedition would be assembled, a fleet of outrigger warships called jong, troop transports and supply vessels, all carrying the intimidating authority of the king. Its mission was not exploration but enforcement, a long voyage to a specific coordinate on the map to restore order. Yet the map itself was the first layer of deception. The seas between the islands were a dynamic, living geography. A channel clear one season could be choked with new coral growth the next. A placid strait could funnel winds into a sudden, violent squall. And beneath the water, the very earth was restless. Imagine such a fleet, hundreds of vessels strong, embarking on its mission of intimidation. It sails for weeks, moving through the labyrinth of the archipelago. Then, without warning, the horizon darkens not with clouds but with ash. A volcano on an island over the horizon enters a catastrophic phase. The eruption itself is a distant rumble, but the consequence is a wall of water, a tsunami generated by the collapse of the mountain's flank, racing across the open sea. For the fleet, there is no outrunning it. The towering waves, carrying millions of tons of debris, would smash the wooden jong into kindling, scattering the armada across the ocean's surface before pulling the wreckage into the deep. Alternatively, consider a more silent era. The fleet's navigators, masters of reading stars and currents, make a single miscalculation as they pass through the Spermond archipelago off Sulawesi. In the dark of a moonless night or the haze of a tropical downpour, the entire formation drifts onto a reef system as sharp as blades. The coral tears into hulls, and within minutes, the sea is filled with the sounds of splintering wood and the urgent shouts of men, as the king's great punishment becomes a trapped and sinking wreck. There is also the human variable, the psychological strain of a long voyage with a grim purpose. A mass mutiny among the conscripted rowers or the soldiers, weary of a seemingly endless journey, could have turned the fleet in on itself, leaving no clear story to ever return to the court. The aftermath of such a loss would be a peculiar administrative silence. At the Majapahit capital, officials would note the expedition's failure to return. The rebellious vassal, however, might interpret the silence not as a disaster, but as a loss of royal interest or perhaps even as divine intervention. The event would be recorded, if at all, in terse, ambiguous lines in a court chronicle, attributing the loss to bad fortune or the will of the gods. The truth, swallowed by the vibrant, treacherous blue of the Indonesian seas, would become just another current in the deep, a secret kept by the very waters the empire claimed to command. This disappearance forces us to see imperial power not as a solid fact, but as a story told across a fragile network. The loss of a punitive fleet was more than a military setback. It was a crack in the narrative of absolute control, a reminder that the ocean could veto the commands of even the most powerful king. The legend of the kamikaze is a story of divine intervention, a typhoon sent by the gods to protect Japan from the Mongol horde. But the ocean's work was not so simple nor so clean. When Kublai Khan's second and colossal invasion fleet of 1281 met the Great Storm, the result was not merely destruction, it was a terrifying act of dispersal. Historical records and recent archaeological work suggest a more complex fate than total annihilation. While thousands of ships were indeed smashed against the shores of Hakata Bay, others were not instantly broken. These vessels, perhaps hundreds of them, were instead caught in the outer bands of the typhoon, ripped from their moorings and battle formations, and flung like scattered leaves into the open ocean. Imagine one of these surviving Mongol ships, a sturdy Korean-built vessel, its mast shattered and its rudder gone, now at the complete mercy of the Kuroshio current. This powerful river in the sea, which the Mongols had used to speed their approach, now became a conveyor belt into oblivion. Carried north and east away from any known land, the ship would have become a silent, drifting prison. Its crew, a mix of Mongol warriors, Korean sailors, and Chinese artillerymen, now faced a slow, unfolding mystery. Their world shrank to the wooden deck under a vast, empty sky. With no means of navigation and limited supplies, they could only watch the horizon, hoping for a coastline that never appeared. Some of these ghost ships may have drifted for weeks before finally succumbing to leaks or thirst, sinking without witness in the deep Pacific. Others might have made landfall on the rugged, uninhabited coasts of the Japanese northern islands, or even further, on the shores of what is now Russia's Sakhalin. Survivors staggering onto a desolate beach would have found not salvation but another kind of trap, a harsh wilderness with no path home and no way to send word of their fate. These scattered remnants of the Khan's armada did not vanish in a single, dramatic moment. They dissipated. Their story expands the kamikaze from a definitive act of destruction into a prolonged and haunting process of disappearance. It reminds us that the sea does not always swallow its victims whole. Sometimes it chooses to scatter them, piece by piece, across thousands of miles of silent water, turning a military defeat into a multitude of private, unrecorded endings. The divine wind did not just destroy an invasion force, it multiplied its loss into countless unanswered questions, each one a tiny fleet disappearing into a different corner of the blue unknown. Portugal's crown was a compass needle forever pointing south. In the feverish decades before Vasco da Gama's triumph, the Portuguese court was consumed by two intertwined quests, the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John and a sea passage to the riches of India. Every captain who pushed a little further down the West African coast brought back maps that ended in terrifying sketches, warnings of a point where the ocean boiled and sea monsters waited. We know the official history, Bartolomeu Dias rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 after a harrowing storm. But what if that storm was not the first of its kind to be faced by a Portuguese fleet? The gaps in the records from this frantic era leave room for a haunting possibility, an earlier, lost armada. Imagine a fleet assembled not for cautious exploration, but for a decisive thrust, commissioned by an impatient king or an overconfident noble. Several of the new, nimble caravels accompanied by slower supply ships, their holds packed for a voyage of many months, their mission to find the legendary passage at any cost. Sailing past the last known markers on the African coast, they would have entered a realm of weather for which their Mediterranean experience was no preparation. The Cape of Storms, as it was rightly named, is where two mighty oceans meet, the Atlantic and the Indian, creating a cauldron of wind and wave that can generate conditions unbearable for 15th century ships. A fleet caught in such a system would not have the luxury of turning back. The powerful westerly winds and the fierce Agulhas current could have done something far worse than sink them. It could have swept them irrevocably off the map. Driven south and east, away from any continental landfall, these ships would have entered the domain of ice. The Southern Ocean is a circling, frigid wilderness, a place of perpetual gales and water temperatures that would have seeped into the bones of the crew within hours. Their caravels, designed for coastal trade and exploration, were utterly unsuited for these latitudes. The sails would have shredded, the rigging frozen. In the blinding spray and fog, ships would have lost sight of one another, each becoming a solitary, freezing prison adrift in a gray and white void. This disappearance would have been one of absolute silence. No wreckage would wash up on a familiar shore, for there were no shores. No last message could be sent. The entire venture and every soul aboard would have been subtracted from the world by the sheer, indifferent physics of wind and current. Their fate would have been recorded, if at all, as a simple notation, a fleet that departed and never returned, its failure quietly folded into the calculations for the next attempt. This potential 11th vanished fleet serves as a dark foundation for the age of discovery. It suggests that every celebrated breakthrough, like that of Dias, may have been preceded by unrecorded sacrifices. The successful voyage that finally charted the route was likely guided not just by improved maps, but by the hard, unspoken lessons learned from those who sailed into the white silence and never came back to tell what they had seen. Silver was the lifeblood of empire, a metallic river flowing from the mines of Potosi to the vaults of Madrid. To transport this unimaginable wealth, Spain perfected a system of staggering precision and equally staggering risk, the treasure fleet or floater. Each year, a convoy of galleons would gather in Havana, having collected silver from Veracruz and emeralds from Cartagena, forming a floating bank whose value could finance wars and shape the destiny of nations. Their departure for Spain was timed to avoid the hurricane season, a calendar dictated by hard-won experience, but the Atlantic does not adhere to human schedules. A storm forming far out in the ocean beyond the sight of any lookout could grow with a speed that defied 16th century understanding. It is within this gap between careful planning and natural chaos that we place a hypothetical yet deeply plausible 12th vanished fleet. Consider a floater that left the Caribbean later than intended, perhaps delayed by administrative disputes or slow loading. Or perhaps a hurricane itself was born earlier and further east than any captain could anticipate. As the fleet sailed into the open Atlantic, aiming for the Azores, it would have sailed directly into the expanding fury of such a storm. This would not be a battle near a coast where some wreckage might later be found. This would be an erasure in the deep ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest landfall. A hurricane's power in the open sea is of a different magnitude entirely. Winds measured not in miles per hour, but in the ability to snap a mainmast like a twig. Waves that are not individual swells, but moving mountains of water that can roll a galleon over, hold it under, and then drag its shattered timbers down into the crushing dark. The silver bars, so carefully stamped and logged, would act not as treasure, but as the final anchor, pulling the ships to the seabed with terrible speed. In such a scenario, there is no witness, no last message. Every ship, every sailor, every chest of coins and ingots disappears in a single, violent event. The silence that followed would be an administrative mystery. In Seville, at the House of Trade, officials would mark the fleet as overdue. Weeks would turn into months with no word. Eventually, the grim conclusion would be written in a ledger, a single line stating the fleet was presumed lost. No court inquiry could be held, for there was no evidence to examine. No widows could claim a body, for the sea returned nothing. The loss would be a staggering financial blow, a hole in the imperial budget that might trigger austerity or loans, but its human dimension would remain a silent, unanswered question. This potential disappearance forces us to reconsider the very nature of historical record. We know the stories of treasure fleets that were wrecked in famous disasters, like the one off the coast of Florida in 1715, because the shore provided evidence. But a fleet lost in the deep Atlantic leaves no such legacy. It becomes a ghost in the archives, a balance sheet entry that hints at a catastrophe of immense scale, yet offers no details to satisfy our curiosity. Its story is the ultimate expression of the ocean's absolute power to not only take, but to conceal completely, turning a grand symbol of imperial wealth into a permanent, sunken secret. The ledger in Seville might close the account, but the Atlantic keeps its own, far deeper records, written in ballast stones and scattered silver, lying in darkness where no light has ever reached. Dominance on the Mediterranean was a daily reality for the Ottoman Navy, its galleys and later ships of the line a constant presence from Algiers to the Dardanelles. Yet even the most vigilant watch cannot see a storm brewing over the horizon of history itself. In the midst of a fierce campaign against Venice or the Knights of St. John, the Sublime Porte would have dispatched squadrons on critical, time-sensitive missions. One such force, tasked with intercepting a rich enemy convoy or launching a punitive raid on a fortified island, could have sailed into a meteorological trap. The Mediterranean, for all its familiarity, is capable of sudden, explosive violence. A rare but documented phenomenon, the Mediterranean tropical-like cyclone, can form with little warning, spinning up winds of hurricane force over waters normally traversed by galleys. A fleet caught in the open sea by such a system would face a chaos beyond any naval battle. Alternatively, a massive and sudden squall line, a wall of wind and water descending from unstable autumn skies, could have swamped an entire formation before any ship could signal for help or run for shelter. There is also the haunting possibility of a catastrophic accident, a chain reaction fire sparked by a carelessly guarded lantern, igniting powder stores across tightly packed vessels under a moonless sky. Such an event would leave no time for distress calls, only a silent, fiery end witnessed by no one ashore. The aftermath of such a loss would be managed not with public grief, but with calculated silence. For the Ottoman High Command, admitting the complete destruction of a squadron not to enemy action, but to the sea or to misfortune, would be a severe blow to strategic momentum and imperial prestige. The loss would be recorded, if at all, in the driest of terms within the confidential naval logs, a line item attributing the absence to bad weather or simply noting the fleet did not return. This bureaucratic discretion, meant to control the narrative, ultimately consigned the event to the footnotes. The sailors, the ships, and the specific purpose of their final voyage would fade, not with a dramatic story, but with the quiet turning of an archival page. This 13th vanished fleet is a ghost of state secrecy as much as of the sea. It reminds us that sometimes the most effective keeper of an ocean's secret is not the depth of the water, but the silence of an empire that could not afford to admit what it had lost. The ledger of a Venetian merchant was a map of the known world, written in florins and ducats. Each entry represented a calculated risk, a voyage measured in profit and peril. Among the most crucial of these ventures was the Muda, the state-sponsored convoy system that was the commercial heartbeat of the Republic. These were not random collections of ships, but meticulously organized fleets of specialized merchant galleys, their departure and return dates fixed by law, their cargoes the very definition of luxury. Spices from the east, silks from Persia, furs and wax from the distant north, all funneled through the Crimean port of Tonna at the Sea of Azov's edge. A single Muda returning from the Black Sea carried not just goods, but the solvency of noble houses and the stability of markets on the Rialto. Its scheduled appearance in the Venetian lagoon was as dependable as the tide until the day it was not. The Black Sea, known to the Venetians as the Mare Maggiore, was a capricious partner in this trade. Its geography is a perfect storm of meteorological danger, a nearly enclosed basin where continental winds can funnel down from the Caucasus Mountains with terrifying speed, whipping the shallow waters into a short, steep chaos of waves capable of overwhelming even the stoutest galley. Fog is another silent predator, rolling in from the north to blot out the sun and every recognizable landmark, leaving a fleet disoriented in a featureless gray void. Imagine such a convoy, perhaps 8 or 10 great merchant galleys, heavy with the wealth of a season, beginning the final leg of its journey west. The captains are experienced, the route is familiar, but the sky to the south begins to bruise a deep, ominous purple. The storm that hits is not a passing squall, but a bora, a wind of legendary violence that descends from the Anatolian plateau with the force of a falling wall. In such conditions, navigation becomes impossible. The galleys, designed for speed and cargo capacity in calm Mediterranean waters, are poor platforms for surviving a tempest. They are driven relentlessly, their oars useless, toward the unseen and unforgiving coastline. The rocky shores of Anatolia or the Crimea offer no safe harbor, only a line of teeth waiting to grind wooden hulls into splinters. The event would be over in hours. By morning, the sea might be calm again, the sky clear, with only a scattering of splintered wood and waterlogged bales of silk to mark where a fortune and hundreds of lives had ended. Back in Venice, the silence would be a different kind of storm. At first, there would be concern over a minor delay. Then, as weeks passed with no word, a cold dread would settle over the city's trading houses. The financial shockwave would be immediate and severe. Patrician families who had invested their entire capital in the venture faced utter ruin. banks that had extended credit based on the expected cargo could collapse. The specific cause of the loss, however, would never be known for certain. In the absence of facts, the canals would buzz with speculation for generations. Was it a storm, or perhaps an attack by Genoese rivals or pirates that left no one alive to tell the tale? The official record might note the fleet as lost, but the true story dissolved into the salt air, becoming one more whispered cautionary tale told by old sailors in the shadow of the Doge's palace. This 14th vanished fleet is a story of commerce interrupted by geography. It reveals how the most sophisticated financial system of its age remained utterly vulnerable to the ancient, indifferent rhythms of wind and water. A single night of fury in a distant sea could erase a column of numbers from a ledger, and with it the fortunes and futures tied to those neat, Inkai rows. The ocean's ledger, written in waves and rock, always has the final entry. A merchant's ledger could not predict the first frost. For the Hanseatic League, that network of free cities binding northern Europe together, time was not just money, it was the wind in their sails. Their entire commercial empire operated on a brutal, natural calendar. Each year, a final, critical autumn convoy known as the Bergenfara would make its run. These were the ships that carried the vital stores for the coming winter, tons of dried stockfish from the Norwegian fjords and precious grain from the Baltic ports of Livonia, all destined for the wealthy markets of Bruges. Sailing this late was a gamble with the sky itself. The captains, masters of the shallow North Sea, knew the risks but trusted their sturdy, round-hulled cogs and their own hardened skill. They had to run this gauntlet, for the economic life of 100 towns depended on the cargo in their holds. Then, one fateful year, the winter arrived not with a warning but with an ambush. An early and severe polar front descended, turning the sea into a churning chaos of freezing spray and towering waves. The storm's fury was only the beginning. As temperatures plummeted, the real trap was set. The powerful wind and current could drive the entire scattered fleet north into the expanding clutches of pack ice. Imagine a single cog, its sail in tatters, suddenly encountering a silent, white wall on the horizon. There is no outmaneuvering it. The ice, deceptively solid, groans as it closes around the wooden hull. The ship is caught fast, a fossil in the making. For the crew, the nightmare shifts from drowning to a slower, chilling reality. Their ship becomes an island in a frozen desert with no hope of rescue. The cold is a penetrating force, and supplies, even if intact, would not last until a thaw that might be months away. The fleet, a community of merchants and sailors, would become a silent, frozen tableau, preserved for a time by the very element that doomed it. Come spring, the warming ice would finally release its grip, and the lifeless ships, waterlogged and broken, would slip one by one into the deep, leaving no marker on the surface. The economic shockwave across northern Europe was immediate and severe. Ports from Bergen to Hamburg awaited ships that would never dock. The price of grain and fish would skyrocket, and winters turned harder for countless families. Yet the specific fate of the men and their vessels remained a mystery. In the counting houses, the loss was recorded in ledgers. In the taverns, it was woven into stories of the hungry sea that steals ships in the night. This 15th vanished fleet reveals a chilling truth about maritime power. Even the most pragmatic commercial empire, built on contracts and careful accounting, could have its balance sheet voided by a single, early change in the weather. The ice did not care for guild agreements or letters of credit. It simply closed, held, and then opened its hand, leaving nothing behind but a column of missing numbers and 100 hearths kept cold by an unanswered question. What does it mean when the environment itself becomes the silent adversary? The scale of the Ming treasure fleets was so immense it defies easy comprehension. While the voyages of the great Admiral Zheng He are celebrated in history, they represent only the central column of a maritime effort of staggering breadth. The main fleet, a floating city of over 300 vessels, was often accompanied by smaller detachments, satellite squadrons dispatched on specific tasks. One such group, perhaps a dozen of the colossal Boeotian treasure ships, could have been sent on a separate reconnaissance mission, ordered to chart an unknown current or investigate a distant land sighting. This squadron, equipped with the finest compasses and star charts of the age, would have sailed with confidence, a tiny piece of the greatest naval power on Earth. Yet once they passed beyond the horizon, the thread connecting them to the mother fleet was perilously thin. A sudden, prolonged fog bank could have severed that connection completely. When the skies cleared, the horizon in every direction would have been empty, an unbroken circle of blue. The squadron's commanders now faced a dire choice. Do they search for the main fleet, risking further disorientation in the vastness of the South China Sea or the Philippine Sea? Or do they press forward on their original orders, trusting their skill to complete the mission and find their way home independently? Either path could have led them into a navigational trap. The powerful Kuroshio current, if misjudged, could have swept them far into the open Pacific, a realm of endless ocean with no familiar stars to guide a return. Alternatively, a decision to sail south, perhaps chasing a rumor of a southern continent, could have brought them into the violent weather patterns of the Southern Ocean, where their broad, flat-bottomed ships, designed for stability in coastal waters, would have been dangerously out of their element. The silence that followed would have been absolute, yet strangely unremarkable in the grand administrative machine of the Ming Dynasty. With the main fleet returning safely, the loss of a dozen ships, while tragic, might have been recorded as a simple casualty of exploration, a line in a logbook attributing their absence to a storm. The sailors, the ships, and their mission would have faded from official memory, becoming a ghost limb of a celebrated body. This 16th vanished fleet forces us to reconsider what we mean by a single endeavor. It suggests that within every great historical achievement, there may lie smaller, complete tragedies, absorbed by the scale of the success. The legacy of Zheng He is one of glorious connection, but it is shadowed by the possibility of silent, parallel journeys that connected to nothing at all, their endings written in water and wind, far from any chronicler's brush. The Mediterranean was a chessboard where Norman adventurers played for kingdoms. These were not the Vikings of northern fjords, but their direct descendants, men like Robert Guiscard, who carved a principality from southern Italy with a combination of ruthless ambition and peerless seamanship. Their longships, adapted for warmer waters, were instruments of shock and awe, capable of striking anywhere along the coast. When such a leader set his sights on a grand prize, like the rich Byzantine provinces across the Adriatic or the Muslim Emirates of North Africa, he would assemble an armada worthy of the conquest. This 17th vanished fleet represents that moment of supreme ambition meeting an invisible counterstroke. Imagine the scene in a Sicilian harbor, dozens of vessels being loaded with siege engines, armor, and the fierce Norman cavalry that had already proven unstoppable on land. The campaign plan is meticulous, the target clear, yet the sea and the politics that swirled around it held variables no plan could contain. One possibility is a brilliant tactical trap. The Norman fleet, confident in its strength, sails into a narrow strait or a seemingly empty bay, only to find the combined navies of two rival powers waiting in ambush. The Byzantines and a North African emirate, traditional enemies, might have forged a temporary, desperate alliance to stop this new threat. The battle that follows is not a heroic last stand, but a systematic annihilation. Every exit is blocked, fire ships are set adrift among the Norman vessels, and the unique fighting style of the Normans, so potent ashore, becomes a lethal disadvantage in the close quarters chaos of a naval engagement. No ship breaks through the cordon, no messenger escapes to carry word of the disaster. the entire invasion force is erased in a single afternoon, its fate known only to the victorious admirals who have no desire to immortalize their temporary allies in song. Another, quieter end could have unfolded far from any battle. A fleet packed with men and animals is a fragile ecosystem. An illness, perhaps carried unknowingly from a Sicilian port, could have begun to spread once the ships were underway. In the close quarters of a medieval vessel, with no understanding of germs or quarantine, a fever could race from ship to ship across the entire armada. Within weeks, the fleet transforms from a weapon of conquest into a drifting collection of ghost ships, their sails hanging limp, their decks silent but for the cry of gulls. A passing merchant might spot such a vessel, listless on the current, and wisely choose to alter course, leaving the mystery intact. The historical impact of such a loss would be profound, yet curiously blurred. For the Norman chroniclers recording the deeds of their lords, a catastrophic naval defeat was an event to be minimized, attributed to a simple storm, or passed over with vague language about a campaign that did not succeed. For the Byzantine and Arab historians, it was a victory to be claimed, but often without lavish detail, lest it inspire future Norman attempts at revenge. The result is a hole in the record, a major turning point softened into a footnote. A Norman kingdom in Greece or Africa never materialized, and the historical focus shifts to other theaters. The lost fleet becomes a phantom, a what-if that whispers from the margins of Chronicles, a reminder that even the most daring heirs to Viking legacy could have their ambitions quietly swallowed by the sea's capacity for secrecy or the cold pragmatism of their enemies. Constantinople's grip on Sicily was a lifeline stretched taut across the Ionian Sea. For the empire, holding the island was not merely a matter of prestige, it was a strategic necessity, a bulwark against the expanding influence of the Aghlabid emirs in North Africa. This was a war of attrition, fought in sieges and skirmishes, and it demanded a constant flow of imperial resources. When reports grew dire from a besieged fortress like Syracuse or Taormina, the response from the capital had to be decisive. A relief fleet would be assembled with urgent purpose, its holds packed not just with veteran soldiers and engineers, but with the most persuasive cargo of all, chests of gold solidi to pay and rally the weary local garrisons. Such a fleet represented more than military aid. It was a tangible symbol of the emperor's reach, a promise that Rome on the Bosphorus had not forgotten its distant province. The voyage itself was a calculated risk through a contested corridor, sailing from the Aegean around the Peloponnese and across the open Ionian Sea. The Byzantine triremes and dromons were exposed for weeks. The Aghlabid admirals based in Tunis and Palermo were masters of these waters. They did not need to control the sea at all times. They only needed to intercept one critical convoy. An ambush could have been set with chilling precision. Aghlabid scouts watching from high points on the Italian coast or from fast, light galleys would have signaled the approach of the heavy Byzantine ships. The Muslim fleet, likely lighter and more maneuverable, could then choose its moment, perhaps luring the relief force into a narrow channel between the mainland and Sicily, or attacking at dawn when the watch was tired. The battle would have been swift and brutal, a focused act of maritime strangulation designed to leave no witnesses, fire pots hurled onto decks, boarding actions by determined fighters, and the systematic scuttling of any crippled vessel would have ensured the empire's gold and its soldiers found a common grave on the seafloor. Alternatively, the sea itself could have executed the ambush. The Ionian Sea is where weather systems from Africa and Europe collide. A perfect storm, a sudden concatenation of winds from opposing directions, could have risen with little warning, trapping the fleet far from any shelter. The heavy warships, built for ramming and boarding, were notoriously poor sailors in high waves. A single mountainous swell could roll a dromon onto its side, the weight of its siege engines and stone ammunition hastening its descent. In such a tempest, the fleet would not be defeated so much as dissolved, its cohesion shattered into 1,000 struggling pieces, each fighting a solitary, losing battle against the water. The consequence in Constantinople was not immediate panic, but a deepening, silent anxiety. Officials would mark the fleet's departure on a calendar, then begin counting the days for its estimated arrival. As those days stretched into weeks and then months with no word from Sicily, the anxiety would harden into a grim certainty. Messengers arriving overland from the Italian mainland might bring confused rumors of wreckage on a remote shore or of Aghlabid celebrations in North African ports, but nothing definitive. In the halls of power, the loss transitioned from a mystery to an administrative fact. The fleet was logged as missing, presumed lost. The true historical weight of this disappearance, however, was felt not in the capital's ledgers, but in the crumbling defenses of Sicilian cities. A fortress that had held out hope for relief, watching the horizon for the sails of the emperor, would eventually see its supplies run out and its walls breached. The commanders on the ground, and later the historians in Constantinople, would inevitably link the two events. The fall of a key stronghold was not just a military defeat, it was a direct casualty of a silence at sea. This is how a vanished armada changes a map, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet, persistent erosion of hope. The empire's frontier in the central Mediterranean did not collapse in a day. It receded one unanswered prayer, one unreinforced garrison at a time, each loss a ripple from a disaster no one ever saw. The heat of the Red Sea is a dry, shimmering force that warps the horizon. From the bustling Egyptian port of Idhab, the Fatimid Caliphate projected its power southward, its eyes fixed on the narrow maritime highway that funneled the wealth of India toward the markets of Cairo. Controlling this waterway was not an option, it was an economic imperative. To break a pirate stronghold or to intimidate a rival port city in the Gulf of Aden, the Fatimid court would dispatch its most formidable instrument, a dedicated naval expedition. This fleet, a mix of sturdy merchant dhows adapted for war and sleek, oared galleys, carried the authority of the Shiite caliph into some of the most geologically volatile waters on earth. Its mission was one of pure enforcement, a show of strength meant to secure a river of gold and spice. Yet the environment here holds specialized dangers that could dismantle such a force with eerie completeness. The first is a phenomenon born not of the sea, but of the desert that kisses its western shore. A Khamsin, a scorching windstorm, can descend without the warning of clouds. It carries not rain, but a suffocating wall of fine, abrasive sand, reducing the world to a blurred, orange twilight. For a fleet caught in open water, this is a navigational nightmare. Visibility drops to the length of a ship. The constant, grating sand fouls rigging, clogs mechanisms, and blinds lookouts. In such a disorienting shroud, a tightly formed squadron could easily lose cohesion, each vessel becoming a solitary island in a howling void. The danger multiplies when you cannot see the reef ahead or the sister ship sailing beside you. A single, grinding impact on coral could begin a chain of collisions as following ships, blind and buffeted, pile into the wreckage. But the sea itself possesses another, more mysterious weapon. The Red Sea's unique topography, with its deep central trench and shallow coastal shelves, can under the right atmospheric conditions generate a series of rogue waves. These are not part of a normal storm's swell, but solitary walls of water that rise suddenly from a deceptively calm sea, reaching heights that can overwhelm and capsize even a large dhow in one catastrophic blow. A fleet could be hit by a succession of these freak waves, leaving no time for distress calls, only a sudden, violent rearrangement of wood and lives. The aftermath in such an environment is a form of natural erasure. The hot, saline waters are exceptionally corrosive, accelerating the decay of wooden hulls. The intricate coral reefs, while beautiful, are relentless. They do not simply snag a ship, they actively consume it, growing over the wreckage within years, incorporating timbers and iron fittings into their own stony structures. For modern archaeologists, this presents a profound challenge. A fleet lost in these conditions might leave no distinct, recognizable shipwreck to discover, only a faint, scattered anomaly in the coral that could be mistaken for a natural formation. The historical record mirrors this physical disappearance. The Fatimid bureaucracy in Cairo was meticulous, but its documents focused on flows of revenue. A fleet that failed to return would be noted as a loss, a line item that might mention bad weather or misfortune before the administrative gaze moved on to the next taxable caravan. The silence in the ledger is the only monument to the sailors and soldiers who sailed from Idhab. Their story underscores a chilling reality of maritime history, that some vanishings are so complete, so perfectly attuned to the local environment, that they leave no trace for the future to find. The ocean's secrets are not always kept in deep, dark water. Sometimes they are hidden in plain sight, dissolved by salt and locked within the vibrant, silent architecture of a reef. The sagas speak of Vinland as a place of meadows and grapes, a green promise west of Greenland, but these stories, passed down through generations, may hold a deeper, more tragic layer. Beyond the sporadic voyages of individual Nars and the small, struggling settlements, there could lie the ghost of a far grander enterprise. Imagine a fleet assembled not by a single chieftain, but by the crown of Norway itself. In the high medieval period, as the kingdom consolidated its power, a monarch might have envisioned a true transatlantic colony, a permanent foothold to secure the rich fishing grounds and mythical forests described in the tales. This would not be a handful of ships but an armada of purpose. The vessels would be laden differently, not just with trade goods, but with the foundations of a new society, breeding livestock, sacks of seed grain, heavy tools for clearing land, and entire families traveling with their worldly possessions. This fleet carried not just explorers, but a community, and the explicit mandate of a king to plant the Norwegian flag on a distant shore forever. Their intended route would have followed the known stepping stones from Iceland to the Greenland settlements, and then southwest toward the rumored coasts. But the North Atlantic is a realm of immense hidden forces. The powerful East Greenland current flows southward along that barren, glacier-rimmed coast, a cold river in the sea capable of seizing a ship and refusing to let go. A persistent fog or a series of storms could have disoriented the navigators, who relied on sunstones and the observation of birds. The entire fleet, heavy and slow-moving, could have been inexorably drawn into the current's grip, pushed north and west into a world of white. The first sign of their doom would not have been a storm, but a low, grinding thunder on the quiet air, the sound of pack ice. The ice along Greenland's eastern coast is a formidable, shifting maze. One day, a channel appears open, the next, it is sealed shut by wind and current. A fleet caught in this closing fist would have no escape. The wooden hulls, no matter how stoutly built, are no match for the pressure of millions of tons of ice. Ships would be lifted, cracked, and slowly crushed, their timbers splintering like kindling in the freezing quiet. For the colonists aboard, the nightmare would transition from voyage to survival on a frozen plain. They might have managed to salvage supplies onto the ice itself, building makeshift shelters from sails and wreckage as the dark polar winter descended. But the environment is relentlessly hostile. The cold is a penetrating force that saps strength and hope. Hunting on the pack ice is perilous and unreliable. The community that set out to build a new world would find itself trapped in a lifeless one, their grand vision shrinking daily to the simple, brutal struggle for warmth and food. Over weeks or months, the silence would have deepened until nothing remained but the wind scouring the ice, and perhaps a few dark shapes half buried in snow, the last markers of a king's ambition. Alternatively, the current could have swept them further, past Greenland entirely and into the Davis Strait, a wider but equally treacherous channel where icebergs calved from glaciers present a different, sudden hazard, a silent mountain of ice emerging from the fog to strike a fatal blow. This disappearance, if it occurred, represents a profound historical silence. It would be the unrecorded end of a more organized, state-sponsored Norse push into the Americas, an ambition that flickered out not with a documented failure, but with a complete and utter vanishing. The sagas we have tell of voyages that returned, of contacts made and then abandoned, but they are silent on the fleet that did not come back, the one that carried the full weight of a kingdom's colonial dream. Its loss would have been a quiet, definitive full stop. In Norway, the prolonged absence might have been interpreted as the colony's success, at least for a time, until all hope of contact faded. Eventually, the venture would be forgotten, its memory overwritten by the more tangible, if temporary, settlements of Leif Eriksson's era. This potential 20th fleet forces us to listen to the gaps in the Viking sagas, to hear not just the stories of adventure they contain, but the deeper silence of the ocean that may have swallowed a much larger story whole. What does it mean when an empire's next chapter is written not on parchment or in stone, but in ice, and then erased by the very same element? The silence of a missing patrol is a different kind of alarm. For the Southern Song dynasty, whose survival depended on the riches of maritime trade, the coast was a nervous frontier. Wealth flowed through ports like Kwangju, but so did a relentless threat, the Waku. These were not mere bandits, but sophisticated pirate fleets that could strike without warning, raiding harbors and vanishing back into the maze of islands. The imperial response was a standing navy of impressive scale, a permanent shield of patrol junks and formidable warships tasked with keeping the sea lanes clear. Their presence was a daily promise of security, a visible assertion that the emperor's reach extended beyond the shoreline. Yet this very duty placed them in the path of the region's most furious natural force. A defensive squadron on station in the Taiwan Strait or the East China Sea would have been watching for sails on the horizon, not for the barometric plunge that precedes a typhoon's arrival. These storms form with terrifying speed, their full fury often hidden until the last moments by the curvature of the earth and the haze of the sea itself. By the time the wind began to scream and the waves rose into mountains, the fleet's options would have vanished. They could not run for open ocean, and turning toward the rocky, unfamiliar coast in such conditions was a death sentence. The squadron, bound by its duty to hold its position, would have been forced to face the storm directly. In the chaos, the very hierarchy of the Navy would have become a trap. The large command junks stable in a normal sea became ungainly giants in the typhoon, their high castles catching the wind like sails, hurling them onto their smaller, more vulnerable escorts. The entire defensive formation, designed to present a united front against human enemies, would have been turned against itself by the wind and waves, ships colliding in the blinding spray as the sea boiled around them. The loss would have been total, and the historical record would reflect it not with a dramatic account of a fleet's demise, but with a sudden, chilling vacancy. Court chronicles from the following years might note a puzzling surge in pirate raids along a once quiet stretch of coast, attributing it to lax officials or increased bandit daring. The truth, known only to the widows in coastal villages and the merchants counting their losses, was that the guardians were gone. The sea had performed the ultimate act of piracy, stealing not just treasure, but the very police force sent to protect it. This disappearance reshapes our understanding of security. It reveals how a civilization's defensive wall, when built upon the ocean, can be dissolved by the ocean's own breath, leaving a coastline naked and a mystery written in the sudden silence of safe passage. Even the great Saladin understood that faith alone could not hold a coastline. His Ayyubid dynasty, forged in the heat of the reconquest of Jerusalem, quickly learned the bitter lesson of the Eastern Mediterranean. supremacy on land meant little if your enemy could resupply by sea. So they built a navy, a determined fleet of galleys meant to break the maritime lifeline that sustained the remaining Crusader strongholds in ports like Acre and Tyre. This was a defensive necessity evolving into an offensive dream, the dream of one final, crushing naval victory that would strangle the last outposts of the Latin kingdom. In the chaotic final years of the Crusader presence, that dream may have launched a fleet to its silent end. Imagine the tension in an Ayyubid port, perhaps Alexandria or Damietta. A major strike force is assembled not for a mere raid but for a decisive blow. The galleys are packed with seasoned fighters, their commanders briefed on the weaknesses in the harbor defenses of a critical enemy port. They set sail at night, aiming for surprise, but the Mediterranean in this age was a crowded chessboard. The Crusader states were not alone. Their survival depended on the naval power of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, whose merchant galleys were never far from the action. It is entirely possible that intelligence of the Ayyubid sortie reached a combined Crusader and Italian fleet. Rather than wait to be attacked, they could have chosen to intercept. The resulting battle would not have been a drawn-out affair, but a brutal, focused ambush designed for total eradication. In the darkness before dawn or in a narrow channel where maneuver was impossible, the heavier European vessels could have trapped the Ayyubid galleys, using their height advantage to rain down missiles and fire before closing in for the kill. The goal would be to leave no one to carry the news home. Every Ayyubid ship captured or sunk, every survivor silenced, to sow maximum confusion and demoralization in the enemy's high command. Alternatively, the sea itself could have executed the fleet's destruction with a different kind of violence. The Levantine coast is prone to a sudden, vicious wind known as a sharav, a squall that descends from the mountains with little warning, whipping a calm sea into a frenzied, deadly chop in minutes. A fleet sailing close to shore, intent on a landfall, would have no time to run for open water. These galleys, built for speed and boarding actions, were dangerously low to the water. A single, massive wave rolling broadside could fill a ship in an instant, pulling it down before the oarsmen could react. A line of vessels caught in such a sudden tempest could be swamped in sequence, a domino effect of drowning wood and men, all within sight of the very coast they aimed to conquer. The historical impact of such a loss would be profound, yet curiously invisible. In the fog of a protracted, multi-front war, the failure of a naval operation might be recorded simply as a setback, or not recorded at all by the Ayyubid chroniclers focused on land campaigns. The immediate consequence, however, would be a tangible shift in the balance of power. The dream of Ayyubid naval supremacy would evaporate with the lost fleet. Their ability to challenge the sea lanes would be broken, leaving the final Crusader ports to be resupplied and reinforced at will, perhaps prolonging their resistance for years. This disappearance is a ghost in the tactical record, a silent pivot point. It reminds us that in war, some of the most decisive defeats are the ones that leave no witness, no monument, and no clear entry in the history books, only a sudden, unexplained quiet on a stretch of water that once held the promise of victory. The grand chronicles of the Crusades are filled with the names of kings and the dates of great battles, but they often overlook the quiet, private tragedies that sailed in their shadow. For every official army marching under a papal banner, there were countless smaller ventures, acts of individual piety and ambition funded not by a kingdom, but by the pooled resources of local lords. One such venture could have been a fleet assembled in a French coastal town, perhaps in Normandy or Provence. A powerful baron, moved by faith or the promise of glory, might have rallied his knights, their men-at-arms, and a community of hopeful followers. They would sell lands and jewels to finance the construction or hire of a squadron of cogs and transports, their goal a direct, daring voyage to the Holy Land, avoiding the perilous and expensive overland trek. This was a crusade of the heart, a private armada carrying the dreams of a single shire rather than an entire nation. Their chosen path was a maritime gauntlet of legendary danger. Departing from the Atlantic coast, they would first have to brave the Bay of Biscay, a body of water notorious for its sudden, violent storms that can rise from a calm sea with little warning. Surviving that, the fleet would then face the long, arduous journey south, skirting the coast of Iberia, a shoreline littered with hidden reefs and known for punishing northerly winds that could drive a ship onto the rocks. The most likely point of a unified disaster lies off the coast of Galicia in northwestern Spain. Here, the seafloor rises sharply, and fog is a frequent, treacherous visitor. A fleet weary from weeks at sea and perhaps already strained by illness or dwindling supplies could have made a single navigational error in the mist, leading the entire formation onto the jagged teeth of the Costa da Morte, the coast of death. In a single night, the prayers of hundreds could have been swallowed by the surf, their vessels broken into unrecognizable fragments against the granite shore. Alternatively, if they made it through the Strait of Gibraltar, a new danger awaited in the Alboran Sea. This western basin of the Mediterranean is a crossroads not just of currents but of conflict. While avoiding the land route, this private fleet sailed directly into a zone contested by Muslim and Christian naval forces. They could have been mistaken for a raiding party or simply been seen as easy prey. An encounter with a larger, more organized fleet from one of the North African Taifa states could have ended in a swift, complete defeat. With no royal standard flying from their masts, they would have been seen as pirates or interlopers, their defeat unremarkable to the chroniclers of the great powers. The silence following such a loss would be profound, but its character uniquely intimate. There was no king to declare a period of mourning, no papal legate to note the failure. The absence was felt in empty manor houses and quiet villages across a French province. Wives and children would wait for a return that never came, their personal grief never elevated to the level of historical event. Their loved ones simply stepped from the world's stage into a mystery, their great venture erased not only by the sea, but by the very informality of its undertaking. This forgotten fleet reminds us that history is built not only on the deeds that are recorded, but on the profound silence of those that were not, a silence that echoes in the unmarked coastal graves and the faded hopes of 100 families who never knew what became of their faith. The might of an empire can be measured by its control of water, even 1,000 miles from the coast. For the sultans of Delhi, whose power radiated from the dusty plains of northern India, the true highways of conquest were not roads but rivers. The Ganges and the Indus were not just sources of life, they were liquid avenues for invasion, allowing the Sultanate to project its formidable army deep into the territories of rival Hindu kingdoms. To master these waterways, they built not ocean-going armadas, but immense riverine fleets, vast collections of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of boats. These were floating platforms of war designed for a very specific kind of campaign. Picture not the high seas, but a broad, brown river under a hazy sky, choked with vessels of every description. Sturdy barges carried the shock troops of the age, armored war elephants, their platforms lashed down, their trunks raised in agitation. Alongside them moved troop transports packed with infantry, horse barges with nervous steeds, and specialized craft laden with the components of siege engines, disassembled trebuchets and towers waiting to be rebuilt on a distant shore. This aquatic caravan moved with a ponderous, terrifying purpose, a city of wood and weaponry drifting with the current toward its objective. Its mission was to outflank land fortifications, to ferry an unstoppable force directly to the walls of an enemy stronghold. Yet this very dependence on the river created a vulnerability of staggering scale. The power that carried them could also erase them in an instant. the Himalayas, those distant, ice-crowned sentinels, held the trigger. A particularly intense monsoon season hundreds of miles upstream in the mountain foothills could send a colossal pulse of water surging down the tributaries into the main river channel. For the fleet navigating a now swollen and furious waterway, disaster could take several forms. One is the sudden, catastrophic breach of the riverbank itself. The land, saturated beyond capacity, simply gives way. A wall of water and mud explodes sideways into the floodplain, not forward along the channel. An entire segment of the fleet, moored or moving slowly near the bank, could be scooped up by this lateral deluge and hurled inland, boats smashed into trees and each other in a chaotic, muddy grave far from the main current. Another, more insidious danger is the flash flood coming down a side valley. A tributary, swollen by a cloudburst in the hills, can arrive as a rolling wall of debris-choked water, hitting the main river at a right angle just as the fleet passes the confluence. The leading vessels are struck broadside by this hydraulic hammer, rolled over and driven under in seconds, creating a dam of wreckage that the following boats, with the river's main force behind them, pile into uncontrollably. Then there is the silent, gathering threat of the log jam. The floodwaters upstream strip entire forests, sending a tangled army of massive trunks and root balls downstream. These collect behind a natural bottleneck, a narrows or a bend, building a creaking, groaning dam of wood that backs up the river for miles. The fleet, drifting with the current, has no warning until it rounds a bend and meets this impassable, shifting wall. The leading boats are impaled and swallowed by the tangle. Those behind, with no room to turn in the narrowed channel, are pressed forward by the relentless weight of water and the rest of the armada, a slow-motion crush of splintering timber that could take hours to complete, trapping every soul aboard in a monstrous, natural cage. The aftermath of such an event is a silence broken only by the river's resumed flow. The military setback for the Sultanate would be catastrophic. The loss of hundreds of boats, thousands of veteran troops, and those invaluable war elephants would cripple a campaign and potentially alter the balance of power for a season. But how would such a total loss be explained? The court historians, writing under the Sultan's gaze, would face a dilemma. To detail the logistical failure or the poor scouting would be to assign blame, perhaps to powerful generals. The safer, more profound explanation was to attribute it to divine will. The disaster would be recorded as an act of God, a terrible omen, or a demonstration of nature's ultimate supremacy over the plans of men. This framing served a dual purpose. It protected human reputations while elevating the tragedy to a metaphysical lesson, and the river itself, the Sultanate's supposed servant, would perform the final act of concealment. Within days, the current would scatter the lighter wreckage, bury heavier pieces in silt, and carry the physical evidence of the empire's ambition far out to sea or deep into the delta's mangrove swamps. The campaign would be remembered not for a battle, but for a disappearance, a reminder that the most formidable forces are not always the ones you send into the field, but the ones you trust to carry you there. The final vanished fleet is a story made of other stories. We conclude not with a single historical record, but with a collective echo, the Phantom Armada seeking a kingdom that never was. For centuries, the legend of Prester John haunted the courts of Europe and the halls of Ethiopian emperors. He was a fabulously wealthy Christian monarch, ruling a lost empire somewhere in the distant east or the heart of Africa, a promised ally who would crush Islam between his armies and the Crusader states. This was not just a tale, it was a geopolitical fantasy powerful enough to launch real ships. It is entirely plausible that one grand expedition, perhaps funded by a coalition of desperate kingdoms or a single zealous ruler, set sail or marched overland with a singular, impossible goal: to make contact with this mythical king. This would have been an armada of belief, its hold stocked with gifts for a non-existent court and its charts drawn from rumor and forged letters. They sailed or traveled not into uncharted waters, but into a cartographic mirage. Guided by descriptions of rivers flowing with gems and mountains touching the moon, they ventured into the Indian Ocean searching for an island that was not there, or up the Nile seeking a city that existed only in parchment dreams. Their disappearance would have been a slow, dreadful realization. As supplies dwindled and the landscape refused to match the maps, the commanding officers would have faced a crisis of faith. Do they press forward, trusting that the next river bend will reveal the golden spires of Prester John's capital, or do they admit the legend has led them into a tangible wilderness? In that moment of hesitation, the real world would have closed in. The expedition could have been consumed by the Sahara, a sea of sand as trackless and pitiless as any ocean, leaving bones and armor half buried for the desert winds to claim. It might have pushed too far into the Congo basin, where the jungle is a living wall, swallowing paths and people without a sound, or its ships, wandering the Indian Ocean on a fruitless search, could have finally succumbed to a storm or the silent decay of a voyage with no destination. This armada vanished in the most complete way possible. It was erased in the gap between myth and map. Its loss would have been recorded, if at all, as another failed quest for the elusive king, its details blending into the broader folklore. No specific fleet is remembered because the search itself was the phantom. This final entry serves as a powerful metaphor for our entire journey. It reminds us that many of these disappearances began not with a failure of seamanship, but with a failure of the stories we tell ourselves about the world. The ocean did not just swallow ships, it swallowed the very assumptions those ships were built upon, the certainty that the map was complete, that the ally awaited, that the horizon promised an empire and not an abyss. In seeking the legend of Prester John, explorers confronted the ultimate uncharted territory, the limits of their own knowledge, and sometimes those limits became a permanent, silent end. These vanishings share a common grammar, a set of repeating phrases written by wind and water. The first and most frequent sentence is the perfect storm. This was not merely bad weather, it was a convergence of forces that left no room for survival. A fleet far from land could be caught between two opposing weather systems, a collision of wind and wave that created conditions beyond any shipwright's design. The second sentence is the uncharted hazard, a single, unseen reef in an otherwise open sea, a sandbar that shifted since the last voyage, or a coastline that appeared where the maps showed only empty ocean. These geographical traps turned confident navigation into catastrophe in an instant. Then there is the slow, silent sentence of navigational error. Before the precise measurement of longitude, a captain's position was an educated guess. A few days of overcast skies could compound a small miscalculation into a fatal drift, sending an armada hundreds of miles off course into a watery desert with no hope of return. Human choices weave through these natural causes, often accelerating the end. Mutiny, born from the prolonged stress of a hopeless voyage, could turn a crew inward, leaving a ship adrift and leaderless until the sea finished the task. Mass illness, what sailors called ship fever, could sweep through the close quarters of a fleet, leaving vessels populated only by the deceased, ghost ships sailing on until they met a reef or a storm. The catastrophic battle, while leaving evidence on land, could be erased at sea. A decisive naval engagement that sank every ship on one side would leave no chronicler among the defeated, only the victor's account, which might simplify a complex fight into a tale of divine favor or superior might. Beneath these physical and human factors lies a deeper psychological layer. Prolonged isolation under the immense blue dome of the sky could warp judgment. The green flash of despair, that moment when a crew collectively loses hope, could lead to a rash decision, like abandoning seaworthy vessels on a false promise of land just over the horizon. Group decision-making under extreme duress often narrows to bad options, choosing the visible reef over the imagined storm, with the entire chain of command agreeing to its own doom. The ocean's vastness played a trick on the mind, making distant threats seem small and nearby safety feel an eternity away. Perhaps the most insidious common thread is not what happened at sea, but what happened afterward in the halls of power. For an empire, the complete disappearance of an armada was an administrative nightmare and a threat to its aura of invincibility. The common reaction was not loud mourning, but quiet suppression. Official records would be scrubbed, the mission scope downplayed, and the sailors' families told vague stories of honor in service to a lost cause. An emperor could not afford for his subjects or his rivals to believe the sea could swallow his will so completely. This state-sponsored silence actively erased the memory of the loss, transforming a public tragedy into a confidential file, a blank space in the chronicle where a fleet used to be. In doing so, they performed the ocean's final act of concealment on land. These patterns reveal a sobering truth. These disappearances were not random acts of misfortune, but systemic risks baked into the very project of imperial expansion. They were a form of natural tax levied on overconfidence. Every time a kingdom built a fleet larger than the last, every time a navigator drew a line on a map into a blank area, they were accepting this hidden cost. The ocean was the ultimate auditor, and its price was silence. The vanished armadas were not failures of technology or courage, but reminders of a boundary, a lesson written in the deep that every civilization, in its moment of greatest reach, had to learn or risk learning in the most final way possible. A ghost fleet never truly vanishes from the memory of the people who waited for it. These disappearances sank into the cultural bedrock, resurfacing as spectral galleons in sailors' yarns and stern parables told to children about the perils of pride. They became the Flying Dutchman of 100 different coasts, a universal story of a ship that sails forever, unable to make port, a warning etched in salt spray about the cost of defying the sea. On a more practical level, the staggering financial ruin left in the wake of a lost treasure fleet or trade convoy forced a revolution in risk management. The concept of maritime insurance was born from this necessity, a direct institutional response to the ocean's terrifying capacity to erase capital. Naval doctrine evolved too, with admirals studying these silent losses, learning to avoid the late-season sailings and tight formations that could turn a storm from a challenge into a tomb. The historical record itself bears the scars of these absences. For scholars, a vanished armada is not an empty space, but a negative shape, its outline defined by the events that did not happen. A trade route that suddenly withered, a planned invasion that never materialized, a rival kingdom that inexplicably gained strength. These are the ghostly impressions left by fleets that sank without a trace, puzzles that historians piece together with the fragments of what remains. Today, the search has moved from parchment to pixels, from folktales to frequency. We now send sound where we cannot see, using side-scan sonar to paint detailed portraits of the seafloor and magnetometers to detect the faint magnetic whisper of iron cannons or anchors buried in silt. Deep-sea submersibles, like mechanical lanterns, can now illuminate the crushing darkness where wooden hulls might still sit, preserved in the cold, still water. These tools have yielded triumphs, identifying lone shipwrecks from known eras. Yet for our 25 Imperial Armadas, the challenge is of a different magnitude. The vast abyssal plains, miles deep and spanning areas larger than continents, are the ocean's true archives. Here, in the endless dark and under immense pressure, a wooden shipwreck does not rest intact. It dissolves, its timbers consumed by organisms and time until it becomes a mere stain in the sediment, a ghost even to our most advanced eyes. Most of these fleets, if their remains survive at all, likely exist in this state, a part of the seabed itself, but the human drive to find them is undiminished. Every artifact that surfaces out of place rekindles the old mysteries. A single shard of Ming Dynasty porcelain found on a beach in East Africa, far from any known trade route, sends a ripple through the archaeological world. Was it carried there by a wayward treasure ship from Zheng He's fleet, a lone survivor of a detached squadron, an anomalous sonar contact on a continental slope, a shape too geometric to be natural, launches a new expedition funded by a mix of academic curiosity and private adventure? Each potential discovery is a thread pulled from the deep, a chance to weave a true ending onto a story that has hung unfinished for centuries. This modern quest is, in its essence, the same force that launched the Armadas. It is curiosity, now armed with robots instead of rudders, seeking not conquest or gold but answers. We are still trying to fill those blank spaces on the map, only now the territory we chart is not coastline but memory. The ocean kept its secrets well, but it may yet, in its silent depths, hold the final logbook for a king's ambition, waiting for a light to finally reach it. From the Roman galleys to the Ming treasure ships, the stories of these 25 Imperial Armadas form a haunting symphony of ambition and oblivion. Each vanished fleet is a note in a larger composition, a refrain of human striving met by the ocean's vast, quiet reply. They remind us that history is not only written by the victors, but also silenced by the sea. For every empire that carved its story in stone, there is a parallel history written in water, a ledger of what was attempted and then erased without a trace. These disappearances were not mere accidents, they were pivotal events with consequences that rippled across continents. A single fleet failing to return could collapse a delicate trade network, leaving markets in disarray and ports falling into silence. It could shift a military balance overnight, granting a reprieve to a besieged kingdom or dooming a distant colony to isolation. Most profoundly, these losses humbled empires, forcing kings and caliphs to confront a simple, unsettling truth that their grandest designs could be undone not by a rival's army, but by a shift in the wind or a hidden ridge of coral. They teach us about the limits of human knowledge in any age. The most detailed map is still a guess about the spaces between the lines, and the most advanced ship is still a visitor in a realm that operates on a scale and power we can observe but never truly command. This is a lesson in humility written in salt water, a reminder that our drive to explore is always partnered with the risk of being forgotten. The enduring power of nature is the final, quiet victor in every one of these tales. The ocean does not fight, it simply is, and its immense, ancient systems of current and weather ultimately decide what passes through and what remains behind. As we close this ledger of lost fleets, remember that the ocean's depths still hold their secrets. The search for answers continues, not just with sonar and submersibles, but in our own fascination with these empty spaces on the historical map. We encourage you to share your thoughts on which mystery fascinates you most in the comments below. Was it the king who sailed away from his throne, or the patrol that vanished from waters it knew by heart? Let us know and subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history, where every shadow holds a story waiting to be recovered. Thank you for sailing with us into the unknown.